Game Developer Association webinar. It's sponsored by the Interactive Audio Special Interest Group. The Interactive Audio Special Interest Group is actually a special interest group for two different organizations. Just this year, it became a special interest group of the International Game Developers Association. And it, for many years, since 1994, it has been a special interest group of the MIDI Manufacturers Association. So what is interactive audio? Interactive audio are the people who work in the game development community and focus on audio, but not just a playback with audio. One of the great things about games is you can do lots of interactive stuff. The IASIG, IASIG, which is what we call it, the IASIG actually developed some great specifications that were adopted by the MMA, including 3D positioning. So you can position things in space using MIDI, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. I am joined today by Mike Kent, who is in the mountains in Canada next to Whistler. He's in a beautiful spot. He's actually on vacation, but he was gracious enough to join us. Mike, thanks for joining us today.
Good afternoon.
And what we're going to be talking about is MIDI 2.0. We're going to cover the basics of MIDI 2.0 very quickly, and then we'd like to actually open it up, if we can, for people to ask questions. So if you do have a question, you can post it in the chat area, and then we will try to moderate those questions and take your questions later on. So let's get started. Let's jump right in. This is the second presentation that we have actually done. We did one for the Interactive Audio Special Interest Group Town Hall, which was took place at the Virtual Game Developers Conference. So let's jump in here. We're talking about MIDI 2.0. So the very first thing that's to realize about MIDI 2.0 is when we set out to do MIDI 2.0, MIDI 1.0 has been around for almost 38 years now. It's been around for a very long time. And so one of the biggest challenges we had was, how do we develop something new while keeping backwards compatibility with all of the literally billions of MIDI devices that are on the planet? MIDI is on every iPhone, it's on every iPad, it's on an awful lot of Google devices, it's on every Windows computer, it's on every Apple computer, it runs on Linux, it runs all over the place. And so there are literally billions of MIDI devices. Mike architected the core idea, which enabled, which actually enables MIDI 2.0, and it's called MIDI Capability Inquiry. And so the very first thing that happens when two devices are connected now, a device that supports MIDI-CI sends out a message, and basically it asks the device it's connected to whether it understands how to do something new. So this is a really, really fundamental part of the way that MIDI 2.0 works. MIDI 1.0, because historically there was a in and an out, there were two separate cables, we never assumed that there was bidirectionality. The Occam's razor solution, the genius of MIDI-CI, is that it says, let's assume there's bidirectionality. And every modern transport, whether it's USB or Bluetooth or Firewire or whatever MIDI is run off over, and it's run off over a lot of things, all the modern transports are bidirectional. So we have this bidirectionality, and what that means is that you can say, do you understand something new? And so if we look at the next slide, which is our very, very, very core picture of what the MIDI 2.0 ecosystem looks like, two MIDI devices are connected. The very first thing that happens is a message goes out and says, do you understand anything new? If it gets no answer, maybe that's because it's connected via 5-DIN and only the in and out on one device is connected, so there isn't bidirectional communication. If it doesn't get an answer, then that MIDI device that is sending the message says, great, I understand that you are, by definition, a MIDI 1.0 device, and you can't do bidirectional communication. So I'm just going to send you MIDI 1.0 messages. So one of the core fundamental things that we focused on was the ability to have backwards compatibility with MIDI 1.0 devices. However, if that MIDI sends out that MIDI-CI message and the responding device says, yes, I can do something new, great. Then MIDI-CI goes in and it starts to ask questions about what are the capabilities. And we've started off with MIDI 2.0, and we focused on what we call the 3 Ps. And we'll cover those very quickly: profile configuration, property exchange, and protocol negotiation. So the three Ps. We are actually in the process of developing other parts of MIDI-CI. We can expand this further, and you'll see how the core design of MIDI 2.0 was designed to be expandable and extensible and to survive for another 3 or 4 decades because of what we opened out in terms of message space. So this is a very quick review. I'm going to go through this very quickly. Profile configuration, property exchange, protocol negotiation. We have already passed, and these things are actually available on the MIDI.org website. We have passed common rules for profiles. We've passed common rules for property exchange, and we have passed the universal MIDI packet format and MIDI 2.0 protocol. So we have passed all of the core documents that enable these core functionalities. And now what I'll do is I'll go in and I will explain what each of these 3 legs of the MIDI 2.0 system are. So profile configuration. Auto configuration uses an agreed set of MIDI messages. And you know, there are a number of examples. GM was almost a prototypical profile configuration. But one of the things that we've been working on in the MMA is something that's very easy to understand. It is a drawbar organ profile. The drawbar organ is a very well understood device. I mean, it's based on the Hammond organs from the 1930s. Everybody knows what they look like. You actually know what the controls are. And there are many, many modern devices. There are software devices. There are hardware devices. And they all basically do this emulation of what a drawbar organ is. I work for Yamaha. Because of Yamaha, we have many drawbar organ devices. We have one made by Steinberg, a software device. We have a software device made by Yamaha. We have a couple of hardware devices. And guess what? They currently all use different MIDI messages. So they're incompatible with each other. That didn't seem like a great solution. This looked like some place where it would be a great idea to have standardization. And so what we're doing is we're standardizing the messages to control drawbars, the messages to turn. That would be a great thing to be able to have. We'll show you some ideas of different drawbar, different profiles that we're working on. But one of the things that I'd like everybody here to start thinking about is, what would a game controller profile look like? I think it would, there's a lot of things that we could do in terms of defining a common set of messages for game controllers, so you could plug any game controller in and use it to control MIDI. That's a pretty powerful thing. So here's some profiles that we're currently considering. We're considering some instrument profiles like piano, a guitar controller, a drum set. We're considering effect profiles, reverb, rotary speaker, parametric EQ. And we're talking about feature profiles. And one of the ones that I'd really like people on this webinar to start thinking about is orchestral articulation. So there are lots and lots of great orchestral libraries. And if you listen to the way MIDI mock-ups are done, a lot of major films are scored almost exclusively using software now. Yes, of course, if you can afford it, it's great to be able to go in and record a live orchestra. But even when you're recording a live orchestra, the people who work in Hollywood always mock those things up in MIDI first. And what orchestral articulation will allow us to do is allow us to put into MIDI messages the way to call those things up. Again, what we were looking at in the MMA is things that were begging to be standardized. So if you look at the way that orchestral libraries currently work, there's lots of different ways to do key switching. Some people use a CC message. They're all doing the same, but they're not doing it in a consistent way. And those are the things that we're looking at and think that that's where standardization really can bring tremendous value. And when we get into looking at the note on message, I'll come back to orchestral articulation because you'll see how that will work. Property exchange, that's the next P. Property exchange is a way to use JSON inside of SysX. So we thought one of the things that is fundamental to property exchange is that we wanted to be able to use human readable messages. That's why we selected JSON. That was important. One of the reasons that's important, it allows a very inexpensive device with a very limited display to get messages from the outside, which actually allows a very smart device to send messages to a less smart device to make it smarter in a way. It can just be used as a delivery system for messages from a computer, for example. Another one of the things that is interesting about property exchange is what you can do with hardware devices. So property exchange, what parameters is CC number 15 mapped to? Get a list of your programs, names, meta tags, set your clock to external. These are all things that you can do with property exchange. If we look at a profile as a macro, where it sets up the entire device, property exchange is a micro. It asks a very specific question and gets an answer to that question, and then can display that answer on a display if necessary. So you can get, set, and subscribe to properties. It uses JSON inside of SysX, and it's machine to machine. So what does that do? It allows easier configuration of detailed parameters. So it's a way to allow devices to communicate with each other and self-configure themselves to be in the right state. I'll give you some quick examples. This is the initiator and responder. And you can look at this, anybody who has any familiarity with JSON, or if you can read English, because it is in JSON, so it's human readable language. You get a manufacturer ID, a family ID, you get all of this information about the device. And then the responder's reply comes back and it has resources and it tells you what it is capable of doing and what questions it can answer. So that's the core part of it. I'll say one thing about something that we just passed very recently, which is get and set device state. What get and set device state was set out to do, property exchange was actually the initial idea for property exchange was developed by Roland, a Japanese corporation that Mike used to work for many years. What Roland wanted to do, their stated goal was to bring the level of recallability of software synths to hardware synths. So this has been something that a lot of people have been dreaming about, which is the ability to have a hardware device that is connected to a computer. You're working with a DAW. When you open the DAW project, the DAW project has all the information to set up that hardware device and put it back in the exact same state that it was when you last used that project. I've had this problem many times myself, where I'm working on something, I have a hardware synth, I go to open up the DAW, and then I spend 30 minutes looking in a drawer for a little USB stick with the right program changes and the right system set up for that hardware synth. This puts all of that intelligence and allows, again, the computer, which is right now, is always in most times the center of your studio, MIDI studio. It allows the DAW to have all that information and send all of that information to the hardware synth. So the last part of the 3 Ps is the Universal MIDI Packet Format and MIDI 2.0 protocol. And this is obviously, the most exciting thing. This is where we were able to expand on what MIDI 1.0 could do. The reality is that well over 10 years ago, the MIDI Manufacturers Association realized that MIDI 1.0 was simply full. There were no more spaces in the MIDI 1.0 protocol to add new messages. And so we had a choice. We either had to do something different, or we just had to say MIDI is finished. It's never going to expand anymore. There was simply no place to put more things. And so, again, with the help of the MIDI Manufacturers Association and the folks from AME, which is the Japanese MIDI organization, for the past 4 or 5 years, we've been very focused on developing the MIDI 2.0 protocol. And we'll take a quick look at it now. So the first thing is the devices agree to use a protocol, and there's a test. And again, if the test fails, then you fall back to MIDI 1.0. It will never be any worse than it already is now. So the baseline is you can do all the wonderful things that you can do with MIDI 1.0. And MIDI 1.0 does a lot of incredible things. I think you guys all know that. It runs the fountains at Bellagio. It runs almost all of the, anytime you go to a live show, it's almost guaranteed that the lighting, a lot of the audio, most of the instruments are going to be MIDI instruments. And so literally you wouldn't have live shows without MIDI. In the game industry, the game industry uses MIDI all the time because it is the key to interactivity in games. But we wanted to do more. So if that protocol negotiation passes, then you can start to use MIDI 2.0, but we didn't want to completely change MIDI. It's just MIDI 2.0 is just more MIDI. It uses the same semantics and mechanisms. It is incremental change, but significant incremental change. And there's backwards compatibility and easy translation. So what does MIDI 2.0 do? Higher resolution. It's interesting to talk about numbers. So most MIDI is based on 7-bit data structures, which means that there are 128 steps in a control change message, for example. We went from 7 bits to 32 bits. And that jump, I think most people who are in the game industry are enough on the engineering side to understand what the impact of that is. That's going from 128 steps to over 4 billion steps. It is a gigantic leap in resolution. And we've been working on ways to do that. I will point out a few things that higher resolution allows. Higher resolution allows you to do things like control FM synthesis with actual frequencies. 127 steps doesn't give you enough frequencies to control an FM synthesizer. 4 billion does. You've got plenty. In fact, you've got more than enough to do that. So we're looking at all the different ways that higher resolution can affect that. And one of the reasons we wanted higher resolution was to be able to better integrate and interact with things like the Unity engine. think about when you look inside of the game world, everything is at a very incredibly high resolution. All the graphics, all of the number crunching is done at a very high level. And MIDI, just because it was developed in 1983, just didn't have that resolution. Now we have it. We have more channels, we have more controllers, we have per note controllers, and we have per note pitch bend. All of these things, the more controllers, more per note controllers, per note pitch bend, all lead to more expressiveness in the musical capability. And also one of the, I think the key goals was to expand it beyond some of the restrictions of being very keyboard based and very oriented towards Western music. This will allow non-Western instruments to be authentically controlled and expressed with MIDI. We have articulation control, expanded tuning capabilities. We tried to make everything simpler, so NRPNs and RPNs are now one message. Bank and program change are now one message. All of these things, in the end, making it just simpler to use MIDI. And this gives you an idea. This gives you an idea of how much further expansion we have. So we have not even used up half of the space that's available in the universal MIDI packet, which our plan is to use. It's called universal MIDI packet because we plan to use it on all transports. It's in a format that is very friendly to modern CPUs and processors. It's either 32 bits, 64 bits, 96 bits, or 128 bits. Those are sizes that are easy for modern systems to throw around and do things with, and so it makes it easier for transports to effectively deal with these messages. But if you look at this, we still haven't even used half of the available messages that we have. So we think there's tons of room for expansion in the future. We get more channels. There are 16 groups on each link, 16 channels per group, so 256 channels. There's one set of system messages and data messages per group, and the protocol is negotiated per group. So I firmly believe that for the next few years, what we'll see is hybrid systems. We'll see systems that have, for example, a MIDI 2.0 keyboard and controllers, but also have maybe a MIDI 2.0 tone generator and a MIDI 1.0 tone generator in it. And that the MIDI messages that are sent to those different parts of that device will be translated, because we worked really hard on making it easy to translate from MIDI 1 to MIDI 2. You can think of the group as equivalent to a virtual cable or a port. That's the simplest way to look at it. So this is a note on message. There's the MIDI 1.0 note on message in the new universal MIDI packet, and it should look very familiar to anybody who has looked at any MIDI data. So you have a message type, which is a little bit new. You have a group, which you could think of as a port. And then you have your channel number, your note number, and your velocity. If we look at the MIDI 2.0 note on message, we have some new things. Yes, we have that same note number, but we now have this new thing called attribute type and attribute data. This is data that we can put into the note on. And it's called a note on, but it doesn't always turn on a note. As you know, it could be controlling a lighting system. It could be controlling video. It could be controlling robotics. We think that there's lots of possibilities for expanding the attribute types, so that the attribute type and the attribute data are very specific for specific use cases and specific applications. One of the other goals of UMP was to add as much capability to MIDI 1.0 as we possibly could. So if you look at this chart, what you see is that system in real time and system common messages, they are the same between MIDI 1.0 and MIDI 2.0. We have the ability to expand them in the future, but we thought starting off it was better to leave those very core things like system real time and system common messages to be absolutely identical. The system exclusive messages are identical, but we'll get into some additions that we did there in a second. And then MIDI 1.0 channel messages, you can't share MIDI 1.0 channel messages and MIDI 2.0 channel messages in the same UMP packet. That is where the difference between the protocols happen. But we added some new things. We added some timestamps, some jitter timestamps to make timing more accurate. You can add those to MIDI 1.0. We added some data messages. One of the problems that you have with MIDI is because it's based on a 7 bits. It's a little inelegant when you want to packetize data that is 8. Everything is actually, you know, everything digitally, it tends to fall into groups of 8, 16, 32. So we made a sysx8 format. It just means you don't have to go through the calculations to turn it into 7 bits. You can just send it as 8-bit data. And then we have a new mixed data message, which we'll talk about in a second. This mixed data messages allow us to send chunked streams of data, and so it's for sending fairly large amounts of information over the MIDI transport. And it doesn't have to be MIDI data. It can be other things than MIDI data. In fact, it's not supposed to be MIDI data. It's supposed to be the other things that you would use in a MIDI system, but you need to transport it over the MIDI transport to get it to another place. So that could be graphics, that could be video, that could be audio, there could be many things that you could do. How it would be applied in games is one of the things that we would like all the people on this call to start thinking about. We have a note message, and we can do direct pitch. So again, this is part of that attempt to free the MIDI 1.0 protocol from being centered around your Western keyboards. This allows you to control the pitch directly in the note on, and you know, you can see that it has a very accurate ability to control the pitch. We have a per note controller. So the per note controller does the exact same thing in a somewhat different format, but you can control the pitch of each individual note. We have more controllers. So we've gone from one of the challenges of MIDI 1.0 is that we only had 128 controllers. Now we have over 16,000 assignable controllers, which are free for the user to use. And we have over 16,000 registered controllers. The idea behind registered controllers is that the MMA and AME will assign those registered controllers to profiles. So we will assign what is drawbar 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We will assign them to specific controllers, registered controllers. That way, they never have to get used for anything else. One of the challenges with MIDI 1.0 is because you only had 128 control change messages, and some of those control change messages were actually mode messages. You didn't have enough controllers, and so you had to keep reusing the same ones over and over, and that was a point of pain for end users. We actually have just are working on a default mapping profile, and what that default mapping profile will do is it will reassign the 128 controllers to things that are very standard. So, a cutoff is cutoff, resonance is resonance, attack is attack, release is release. Those are actually not default settings. It's just that many MIDI devices, because of historical reasons of mostly general MIDI, had those controllers assigned to those CC messages, but the end user could go in and use MIDI learn and completely change that. They're still able to do that, but now we can turn on a profile, and if the device supports that profile, it puts the device back into a known state so that it's a lot easier to do some really cool things because it's configured correctly. This is the mixed data message, and as you can see, it has the ability to have multiple streams of data, and it is set up in a chunking system, which would be familiar, I think, to a lot of the people in the game industry. This allows us to transport these large data sets over a MIDI transport. And literally, it can be anything that you can digital that you can put into that data payload packet. You have to figure out what to do with it on the other end, but it has a tremendous amount of freedom in what you can put into a mixed data set. Compatibility, again, this is the first and foremost thing we were thinking about. You use MIDI-CI to confirm MIDI 2.0 support, and use MIDI-CI to confirm and successfully do the protocol negotiation. If that doesn't work, then you fall back to MIDI 1.0 protocol. We have done a lot of work in translation that is actually in the specification, which is you can download from MIDI.org. And so we've tried to provide everyone with all of the information that they need to be able to develop MIDI 1.0, MIDI 2.0 products, and also have those MIDI 2.0 products work with MIDI 1.0 devices. So that's a picture of how you do the default translation. Pretty straightforward. Compatibility from an architectural point of view, each UMP group connects to one MIDI 1.0 stream. Okay, so again, we were always thinking about how do we take this new thing and translate it back into so that it works with older devices. So I'm going to stop there. I don't know if we have any questions. I'm not actually seeing any chat.
Okay, so Kurt asked,
yep.
Has anyone announced forthcoming MIDI 2.0 controllers that have single atomic controls that are auto-translated to MIDI 1.0 and RPN for older devices? And I would answer that by saying no. However, that's not the intended way this is supposed to work, if I understand the question correctly. MIDI 2.0 devices, before they start using MIDI 2.0, are supposed to ask the receiver, is it okay if I send you MIDI 2.0 messages? And if the receiver says yes, then it can send it, everything's fine. And if the device doesn't respond to MIDI 2.0, then you're supposed to send it MIDI 1.0 messages. So you're supposed to select one or the other based on who you're sending to. Sometimes you don't actually know the destination of the data, and there will be MIDI translators. We expect that actually operating systems are going to have MIDI translation built in, so that if you're, say, sending from a MIDI 2.0 controller keyboard and it's going to several destinations inside the OS application, and one's a MIDI 1.0 aware application, the OS, we expect the OS to provide the translation, so the MIDI 1.0 device receives MIDI 1.0 data. And so some of this should be pretty seamless to the user. And so yes, you can send MIDI 2.0, MIDI 1.0 to two separate places simultaneously. It's just not, I'm not sure that it's done exactly the way you're asking it.
Yeah, Mike, maybe you could talk a little bit, since you were the author of the new USB MIDI 2.0 specification. You know, backwards compatibility and switching, even at the transport level, was taken into consideration as well, right?
Well, sure. In the USB MIDI specification, the new USB MIDI 2.0 class specification deals with how USB MIDI 1.0 hardware can be used, and new USB devices that use MIDI 2 can be used together. And it's to some extent, to a large extent, that's why we have this universal MIDI packet. It allows us to send MIDI 1.0 and MIDI 2.0 together in a stream and within a system, so that the idea is this unified architecture where MIDI 1.0 devices exist, and MIDI 2.0 devices exist, and they all work together. And to the best of our ability, try to define it so that auto configuration happens, so he doesn't necessarily have to step in too often to make these connections and change settings based on where things are going. And so those are that combination architecture where multiple things come together is just a key component of what we did. I maybe just bring up a quick slide here. So the universal MIDI packet has these 16 groups, which can carry MIDI 1.0 or MIDI 2.0 data, but each group of those is more or less the equivalent of a MIDI 1.0 stream with 16 channels. And so this is just one of the architectural concepts that applies to transports, including the USB transport, on how this data is carried in this one universal MIDI packet.
Yeah, I mean, and we should point out that Apple, Google, and Microsoft are all members of the MIDI Manufacturers Association and have been very involved with the development of the MIDI 2.0 specifications. And so, we're looking forward to the support of the OS companies, and we think that's it's coming. Yeah. We can't say when, because that would get us in big trouble, but we do know that they are working very hard on it right now. As well, the MIDI Manufacturers Association has almost all of the major DAW players, and by that I mean Logic is a member because Apple is a member, Steinberg is a member, Mark of the Unicorn is a member, Ableton is a member. So
you're going to miss somebody important.
I'm going to miss somebody, and they're going to get mad at me, and they're probably on the call. So yeah. if you're on the call and you're a DAW maker, please, say your name in the chat room, and we'll give you a shout out.
Yeah, I think it's worth just expanding on what you said there about the three OS companies, Google, Apple, and Microsoft. They don't announce something until they're ready to announce it. So they're very careful to not make promises unless they know for sure they're about to deliver, or like today or tomorrow kind of thing. But Apple has already delivered some of MIDI 2.0 in the operating system in the form of MIDI-CI support. It really doesn't do much right now because there's no profiles or property exchanges that were defined when they did it. So, but they've got underlying architecture that's there, and developers can find that in the core MIDI stuff since last year, as a matter of fact. And I assume that the OS coming out this year and over the next couple of years, they'll increase their level of support there. Microsoft did, Pete Brown of Microsoft gave a presentation at the NAMM show that did outline some of Microsoft's ideas about their direction for MIDI 2.0, again, without making any commitment to say they were actually going to do it, but it's a good indication. And Google, Phil Burke particularly from Google, has been involved in this whole direction of MIDI 2.0. He's been one of the most active contributors over the last 15 years, really, to all of the ideas that have kind of come together recently in this MIDI 2.0. So I'm pretty confident in those three OS companies. The other thing that's important is kinds of middleware. For example, a lot of applications that use MIDI are built on Juice. And then there are all kinds of middleware products for games and interactive audio. And I think we're pretty confident that those companies are indeed aware of MIDI 2.0, but I haven't seen anything in the way of an announcement. And it's funny, that's exactly something in the chat window. Kurt just asked, do we see integration in the OS as the only target as doing most of the heavy lifting, or do we also see adoption by game middleware tools like FMOD and Wise and so on? So Unreal, Unity. We would love it if all of those middleware applications built MIDI 2.0. And I think if anybody from those companies is listening, we would love to give you a bit of support in getting there and answer any questions or help you figure out where that goes. But I do know that some of us are some people in the MMA are in touch with some of those people, and so I think that we'll get there. All of this takes a little bit of time. MIDI 2.0 doesn't replace MIDI 1.0. We're really trying to make this a transition so that MIDI 1.0 is not replaced. However, we slowly transition to a system where MIDI 1.0 and MIDI 2.0 live together within the same architecture. And so we see the first MIDI 2.0 devices coming in 2021 probably. You'll be able to actually use MIDI 2.0. Roland already announced a keyboard that is MIDI 2.0 ready. In other words, it has MIDI 2.0 capability, but it doesn't do anything because there's nothing to connect it to yet. We'll see these things roll out, and I think those middleware companies will adopt over the next 2-3 years as MIDI 2.0 starts to take hold and become a part of the MIDI environment. Any other questions in the chat? Not so far.
Well, hopefully this was a good introduction to everybody. And if you do have any questions, you can certainly reach out to us. Let me do this. I will share my screen and I will put this up there so that you can that's Mike's email address and my email address. So if you do have any questions, we urge you to reach out to us directly. We're happy to answer any questions. We're also, happy to get together one-on-one if your company is serious about MIDI 2.0. We're happy to get on a call and discuss your specific needs. I think both Mike and I are very excited about the next, I'm going to say 12 to 18 months. I believe that we will start to see MIDI 2.0 products in the marketplace probably within the next 6 months. And some of, I will put a caveat on that. Some of the first MIDI 2.0 products will be MIDI 1.0 products that get a firmware update to support property exchange and profiles, because property exchange and profiles, we didn't cover this, property exchange and profiles can be done on MIDI 1.0 devices over 5-pin DIN MIDI. So we did not forget about 5-pin DIN. Two of the 3 pillars of the 3 Ps, it is possible to use those capabilities, including property exchange and certainly profiles over 5-pin DIN cables. So again, you may see some devices that are already in the market. They get a firmware update that allows them to support a profile or allows them to support something like get set device state. So yeah, look for those coming, and those are months away, not years away.
I think
and as Mike said, Roland already announced a year ago a MIDI 2.0 capable device. What we're waiting for now, and it is coming, is the support of the OS companies and the support of the DAW companies, and all of that is in the works. So it's just a matter of time. The next 12 months is going to be pretty exciting for MIDI, I think. What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, this goes back to something you just said a second ago about the support on 5-pin DIN, and it goes beyond 5-pin DIN. It's really about the whole architecture of MIDI, and the underlying framework is already there to do profiles and property exchange. And I think the only reason it hasn't that hasn't come is because we haven't finished writing the profile specs themselves or the property exchange specs to make things start to do some of these things. But we don't need a complete new architecture to do everything. We just need that new architecture really to support the universal MIDI packet in the near future. Then all of MIDI 2.0 can be realized. But some of it, as you said, firmware updates to existing products will start to implement, particularly some of these auto configuration things that are done by property exchange and profiles. And so step by step, the next 6 months will be exciting as we see the initial things happen. And I'm looking forward to, this orchestral articulation thing that we've been working on, and that I think will probably, be released as a spec in early 2021. I think that's going to change the way people work, change the workflow, and make it so much better for composition and arranging in the studio. I'm just excited about so many aspects of this for different people. I'm working with some people in India on a product that they want to use to deal with the kinds of pitch nuances that are in Indian music and different ragas and so on. And MIDI 1.0 just didn't deliver the goods, easily. And so they're all excited about MIDI 2.0 for new reasons. So there's a lot of areas to be excited about for MIDI 2.0.
Yeah, and I'll leave one final thing. It always blows my mind because we still see the most successful Kickstarter programs. The most successful Kickstarter program of all time was the Artiphone, and they raised $1.6 million. But there was just another Kickstarter program. They started out, and I think their goal was $20,000, and they raised $1.2 million. And it's just a MIDI 1.0 device. It's not even MIDI 2.0. So, MIDI has always been the center of innovation in the music technology industry, and it continues to be. And I think it's going to be really exciting to see all that stuff. But what we're here for is we're really looking forward to seeing what the game industry does with MIDI 2.0. So let's keep that conversation going. We'd like to thank you for participating. We want to especially thank Natalie Wallace for being such a great host and setting us all up, and the International Game Developers Association. And finally, of course, our friends over at the Interactive Audio Special Interest Group, Kurt Hayden and all of the folks on the International Audio Special Interest Group Steering Committee, which we meet regularly, and they're doing some great things, and look for more information from them on the IGDA website. So thanks for participating, and hopefully we'll do it again soon. Thanks.